Good morning, everyone. We will be studying today the topic of why a child's circumcision is so precious, and I'm starting from the selections from Likutei Sichos, the first Sicha, the first section. The Medrash relates that Yitzchak and Ishmael contended with each other when they were young. Ishmael argued, "I am more beloved than you in God's eyes, because I was circumcised when I was 13 years old." Yitzchak countered, "I am more beloved than you because I was circumcised at 8 days." So they had an argument, who is more favorable, which way is more favorable before God's eyes? Ishmael, that's when he was 13, is mature, or Yitzchak when he was 8 days old, that he couldn't even speak or stop his father. The reason Ishmael was circumcised at 13 saw himself a more beloved is easily understood. As the Medrash states, Ishmael boasted, "I had the opportunity to object, but I didn't." However, so that's what makes him great, because he had the ability to say no, and he didn't. However, we need to understand why Yitzchak claimed that being circumcised at 8 days was a reason to be cherished more. Yitzchak says, "No, I'm greater than you. I'm more cherished by God in my behavior at the 8 days." Some commentators have explained that the virtue of being circumcised at 8 days is that fulfilling a mitzvah at its prescribed time is preferable, and the time for circumcision is when the child is 8 days old. Some say, you know why the uniqueness of Yitzchak is when God gives us a commandment, it is preferred to do it at the appropriate time. There is always a second chance. There is always an ability to make up. But if you want to serve God properly, do it when God said so. And therefore, Yitzchak did it when God said so, 8 days, not 13. Says the Rabbi, that explanation, however, requires further clarification. First of all, Ishmael's circumcision was also performed in the time when God first commanded it. You can say later on, when someone was not circumcised, and he circumcised himself at the 8 months, or 8 years, or 80 years, it's not as great as 8 days. That makes sense. But when Ishmael circumcised at the age of 13 years, that was the time God commanded him. He didn't do it late. For the command that Ishmael be circumcised was only issued when he was 13 years old. Therefore, it cannot be said that he lacked the virtue of fulfilling the mitzvah at its appointed time. The appointed time for him to fulfill this mitzvah was when he was 13, so he didn't do it late. He didn't do it after the time it was asked. Indeed, as explained in a previous occasion, had Abraham, and by extension Ishmael, circumcision not been performed at the time God commanded, it would not have been appropriate to perform it at that time. If Ishmael would go and do it at the age of 8 days, he wouldn't be serving God. If Abraham did it at 8 days, he wouldn't be serving God, because God did not command him. The commandment came, and that very day he did it. So 13 for Ishmael is the right time. Earlier is not appropriate. He's not serving God. To explain, Abraham and Ishmael were circumcised on Yom Kippur. That was the day God appeared and made a covenant with Abraham. Now, Abraham observed the entire Torah before it was given, and that included the law of circumcision that is not performed at its appointed time may not be performed on Shabbos or festivals. Hence, Abraham was permitted to circumcise himself and Ishmael on Yom Kippur only because he was commanded to perform the circumcision at that time. Thus, circumcision of Abraham and Ishmael had the status of mitzvah performed on its appointed time. That says, from a halacha point of view, it must be that they performed the mitzvah at its appropriate time. How do I know? Because God commanded Abraham the mitzvah of circumcision on Yom Kippur. Abraham kept the entire Torah. The fact that he wasn't circumcised before, we will discuss it later, I think the Rabbi is going to talk about. But he performed all the mitzvot. By Jewish law, a circumcision may be performed on Shabbat or Yom Kippur only if it's 8 days old. If the child's circumcision is pushed, let's say it's jaundice, or there is other reasons, he's in a incubator.
C-section, you can't do it.
Why not?
My son was a C-section.
My son was C-section. We did it at 8 days old. My oldest son.
8 days, but not on Shabbat.
Who told you that?
The whale that did my son, and the rabbi that did my son years ago.
It's the first I hear. I can find out. I know my son Baruch was born C-section, the only one. Another 9 times afterwards who's natural, which is a miracle.
But the point was, it's 8 days. You can do 8 days, but if the 8 days is Shabbat, you have to do it the next day.
I have not heard that. I must tell you.
Because it's a C-section?
Because the baby didn't forthcome.
Naturally. I hear what you say. I never heard that. I've never heard that. So I may be wrong.
Well, I know because it was my son. It was Josh.
Jewish law tells us that by the way, a Brit on Yom Kippur is very, very holy, very special.
Yeah, you don't
because no, you do it in the afternoon and you do the party after. But it is the first time God commanded Jewish people to circumcise on Yom Kippur, and that's the day Abraham performed the bris. Now, if it was considered not in the appropriate time, but a secondary, then he wouldn't allow to do it on Yom Kippur. He's allowed to do it on a weekday, not on a holy day like Shabbat or Yom Kippur. So says the Rabbi, from Halacha point of view, it must be that Abraham and Ishmael performance of their mitzvot, of circumcision, was done in the highest level possible, and it was not considered delayed or done in a different outside.
How come then, when the Jews were in the desert, they did not do circumcisions in 8 days? Because we already had the halakha, we already had
They did not circumcise, except the Levites.
Oh, tell me about this. What?
Joshua, before entering the Holy Land, God says to Joshua, they must be circumcised. So he circumcised all the Jewish people. You know what they did with the foreskin? They made a pile, a huge pile. It says Givat Aralot. Orla is the foreskin. They named that place Givat. Givat is the ramp or mountain. Aralot, Orla of the foreskin. So one after the other, they did shechting. They did one after the other.
The was 8 days.
The question is, why weren't they? Do you know that the Passover sacrifice they also did not perform in the desert except the first year and the last year, 39, 38. It's not. On a simple answer, it was inappropriate. The answer given is that they were in the desert. While you travel, you're allowed to delay. Just like Moshe with his 2 sons, he wasn't circumcised. And a serpent came and started eating him up until Tzipporah, his wife, realized that because the son was not circumcised. And she took a sharp rock, and she circumcised her son. And she called him Chatan Damim. You are the one who almost took away my husband. So on the road, it's dangerous by Jewish law. Okay. If someone had a operation, within 3 days they should not travel, because travel is very susceptible to getting ailment. Now, I'm not talking about today flying or going in a car. Those days you ride on a donkey, so first you're shaking the whole travel, and second the environment is affecting. So it's not as today. But that's Jewish law. The same is circumcision. So because they were in the desert, they didn't know if tomorrow they're going to travel or not. It was every morning they would look at the cloud. If the cloud was gone, they know they have to leave. If the cloud was still tied to the temple, to the tent of meeting, they have to stay. So because every day they were preparing to leave, they couldn't circumcise. Because once you circumcise a son, you have to keep him in that place for 3 days. That's the explanation. However, I should say, the Levites did circumcise their children throughout the years.
So how did they get away? What happens when they had to travel?
They trusted God.
I hope they didn't use a rock.
Huh?
What else are they going to use?
They can use anything. By the way, rocks are very sharp if you know what you're doing. And by the way, metal is susceptible to viruses and bacteria that can grow. Rocks, I don't think so. It's a much stronger material, less bacteria is growing. So if those days they did not know how to, what do you say, to purify in hot water or whatever, to sterilize, rocks was the ultimate tool. And if
Just use the new one.
I don't know why you're saying that. I don't know why you're saying that, because rocks, they can be very, very sharp. The edge can be as sharp as a blade of metal today. The flintstone. So, says the Rabbi, from a halacha point of view, Abraham and Ishmael were circumcised on Yom Kippur. You know how is it possible? Because they do it when God commanded them. If they were to delay, they would not be allowed to do it on Yom Kippur. So from a halacha point of view, you cannot say that Ishmael performed the mitzvah of circumcision second rate. It's impossible. When it comes to covenant with God, that covenant will forever last and nothing can come in between. That's what God is everlasting. This is one of the reasons why Abraham did not circumcise himself until God commanded him. Although he observed the entire Torah before it was given, Abraham waited until God commanded him to perform this mitzvah because a created being cannot bring about an eternal covenant, since he and any covenant he establishes is subject to change. A bond that is everlasting can only be accomplished through the unlimited power of the Creator. He who declares and thereby empowers that my covenant will be an eternal covenant. Did you understand that? Now we can understand. Abraham performed all the commandments God gave them. That's why when the angels come to visit him at the beginning of the portion, he's baking the matzah. Why is he giving the matzah? Because it was Passover. He performed all the mitzvahs, even though the events that led to the mitzvahs did not happen yet. But he knew it's part of God's commandments. There is one commandment he couldn't perform. There are two actually, but we're talking about one, and that is a circumcision. Because the commandment to be circumcised was not given yet. Because it was not given yet, if the human being performs it, he's not performing it in the way God wanted it. A covenant with God. Only God can call for such a covenant which is eternal. A human being can call a covenant, but it's subject to conditions. It can be changed, it can be nullified, it can be broken. And therefore, he waited for God to command them to do the circumcision. So therefore, an eternal covenant is unique between us and God, that God is the only one who can create it, and therefore this is something that no man can initiate on his own, because initiating on our own is a whole different covenant. It's a covenant that's subject to changes.
When God gave him the Torah beforehand, then he gave him the commandment for circumcision. It's in the Torah, no?
God did not give him the Torah, but he knew the entire Torah.
So then he knew that
he knew it in spirit. According to many commentators, for example, Yaakov performed putting on tefillin in a spiritual way. So not every commandment they did in the physical sense of the universe, because God didn't come down.
It's pretty straightforward, right? I mean, it says circumcision in Torah, right?
But he lives before God said it. Therefore, he could not do it on his own. In other words, the commandment of the Torah before it was given was an option. They took it upon themselves without being obligated. Okay? And therefore, circumcision he couldn't take upon himself. So keeping kosher, keeping Shabbat, keeping Yom Kippur, keeping matzah is something they took upon themselves. Circumcision you can take upon yourself. Because the only way for...
That would be the one I would take.
If it's optional. Meat at the same time.
No, he didn't.
Well, okay.
It says butter and then meat. Don't change with the text.
What butter?
He knows what I'm talking about.
I know exactly what
He ate butter.
That's what he served.
he served. Okay, he's guessing.
It says in the Torah, it says in this
Yeah,
exposure, Vayikach chem'a v'chalav, he took butter and milk, uven ha'bakar asher asa, and the steak of the sheep that he grilled. V'omed alehem, and he stand above them. So according to commentators, he served them first dairy and then meat. After dairy, you can wash him out and have meat. In addition, you can do it on two separate tables, and they can eat whichever one they want. In addition, they were angels; they didn't really eat. So, please, let's not take a leap here. Only now can we understand why the timing of the bris is when an infant is at a tender age of 8 days. Now we can address one more thing. Why is the commandment at 8 days? What's wrong with when he's bar mitzvah? At that age, the child about to be circumcised is certainly too young to do anything by his own power to actively participate in the performance of this mitzvah. When the baby is 8 years old, he does nothing to participate. He does not give any, and he does not offer any participation. When a person hopes to achieve something with his own power, he needs to prepare over time until he is ready and able to accomplish that goal. In contrast, the covenant that is established through the mitzvah of circumcision is brought about entirely by the Creator. Man plays no role whatsoever in bringing it about. Do you understand that? Because only God can create an eternal covenant, God chose 8 days. You know what? 8 days is already safe out of danger, endangerment. But at the point that the child cannot participate, he's not going to say, yes, I'm ready. He's not going to say, I'm happy to do that. He's not going to say, I'm willing to do it. You know why? Because then human intervention is going to soil, so to say, spoil God's covenant, which is eternal. True, the actual deed of the mitzvah is performed by man. It's on his body. However, the covenant that is achieved by that act is brought about entirely by God. In other words, it is not that man bonds himself to God through the fulfillment of the mitzvah of circumcision. The opposite is true. When a Jew is circumcised, the act opens the door to God bonding the Jew to him with an eternal covenant. In other words, the child, all he does is offer his body, but all the acts and all that involved is done from God's point of view. No participation, actively involvement whatsoever from the human. Now we can understand why there is no reason to wait for the child to be old enough to willingly and actively participate in the observance of the mitzvah. Simply put, the bond established through circumcision is not his own accomplishment at all. That's why at the very first opportunity, as soon as the child is strong enough to undergo the procedure, he is circumcised. Did you understand that? Now we can understand. 8 days is not just when God said to do, I did it, because that's a detail. 8 days is the time when God's covenant can penetrate the human in its entirety without any obstruction from human. If the man is done at the time when he's 5 or 10 or 13, at that time he has to be willing. So there is some part of the human involved in the circumcision. Now you're tainting that type of circumcision which is eternal. The uniqueness of Yitzchak's circumcision. On this basis, we can appreciate the uniqueness of Yitzchak being the first to be circumcised when 8 days old, and the advantage of his circumcision over that of Abraham and Ishmael. Now we can understand why Yitzchak comes and says, the Medrash says, who is inaugurating the mitzvah? Yitzchak, even though God gave it to Abraham and Abraham did it first. But the true circumcision, which is a covenant for eternity, is done only by Yitzchak, not by Abraham. Abraham was given the mitzvah of circumcision only after preparing himself through serving God over the course of 99 years of his life. Throughout all this time, he followed an orderly progression, beginning with to recognize God, recognize his Creator at the age of 3, and proceeding through a series of stages. At that recognition was intensified at 40 and at 48. Throughout this time, Abraham carried out his life's work of making God's presence known to mankind. Ultimately, he reached the highest degree of perfection possible for a created being. Only after accomplishing all this was Abraham given the from above the mitzvah of circumcision, through which he became perfect. In other words, he progressed. He went by to different stages, 3, 40, 75, 48, And he's getting closer and closer, many, many tests by which at the age of 99, God says, now you achieve perfection, now you deserve an eternity, a covenant for eternity for you and your descendants. But it's all because of all of Abraham's accomplishments. It was not immediately evident that the covenant and connection with God established through Abraham's circumcision came entirely from above. Now you see that there is a lot of involvement from Abraham himself. In truth, even for Abraham, his divine service was not the cause of or reason for the circumcision, since, as explained above, the covenant established through circumcision is eternal, and forging such a timeless bond is not within the power of a created being, even one of Abraham's stature. As Rambam teaches, everything that is brought into being will ultimately cease to be. This teaches us that a created being cannot achieve such eternal and eternality by virtue of his own power and achievements. Even a person who is truly great, who fully and clearly understands the mitzvah, is no closer to creating such a bond than one who is genuinely small and completely lacking in understanding. Says the Rabbi, Abraham really achieves greatly to reach to that point, there is no doubt. But at the end of the day, there is a major leap to the type of covenant God made with them that a human can never reach. Only God came down and offered that covenant. Abraham's divine service then was merely a preparation for the covenant with God. After he carried out this divine service in such flawless manner, achieving everything a created being can accomplish despite his limitations, God granted him a gift from above, an eternal covenant. He did not achieve he was not a partner in the covenant. Only because he prepared himself so well, God bestowed upon him that gift of covenant for eternity. However, the relationship between Abraham's divine service and the covenant of circumcision is reflected in the Talmudic adage, had the recipient not generated satisfaction for the giver would not have granted him a gift. In no way is the satisfaction the recipient generates a payment for the gift. It certainly does not compel the giver to give the gift, for a gift is motivated by the initiative of the giver. Conversely, however, a gift is given only because the recipient generated some form of a satisfaction for the giver. The Rabbi in parentheses explains that when someone offers a gift, he doesn't offer a gift to someone else unless the recipient initiated something. He was very kind to him, he loves them, he's always with them. Whatever reason, the recipient initiated something. But you cannot say that this is a payment equal to the value of the gift. The gift is offered from the goodness of the giver, and therefore you give the full credit to the giver. You cannot say, when I go and I have a bar mitzvah celebration, or I get married and someone gave me a check for $100, to say, well, I'm not giving, the one who gave it to me, he gave it to me because he received value of $100 from me when I was very kind to him or always spending time with him. It doesn't make sense. Of course, the recipient did something, but that is nothing in comparison to the gift that he received. Does that make sense? Now the same is Abraham. Abraham, of course, did all the preparation and all the dedication and all of going out for God's sake despite the entire universe. But the value of the gift he received in circumcision pales, not even pale, is no level, no comparison to what God offered him. Why are you closing? We have 2 more minutes.
No, I read it.
The value of the gift at Yitzchak.
Abraham.
Oh.
The Rabbi is very careful to say that the covenant God made with Yitzchak, God made with Abraham too, even though it was a much later date. So the Rabbi is going through a very lengthy discussion to point that even though Abraham initiated that gift through all the preparations, at the end of the day, when God made a covenant with Abraham, it was not because Abraham is actively participating, but only for Abraham's preparation for that point. And once that's done, it's granted to all the children without preparation anymore. So Abraham's gift is also very, very valuable. However, when it comes to Ishmael, and this is what the rabbi is not going to talk. Oh yeah, the rabbi is going to talk about it. Ishmael, circumcised at the age of 13, he did no preparation, but he says, "I'm willing to do it." He could have protested, because he is actively involved with the circumcision. It's not as valued, it's not as cherished as the way it was done by Yitzchak, which is all of God's activity. Do you understand? Now let's finish reading. We don't have much. Since Abraham's circumcision was preceded by his divine service, that divine service contributed to his fulfillment of the mitzvah, at least to some degree. Indeed, Abraham's very performance of the mitzvah of circumcision is associated with his decision that he must circumcise himself. The fact that he says he's willing to do it, he participates as well, Abraham. Accordingly, it is not so obvious, nor is it emphasized to a great degree, that the covenant established through Abraham's circumcision came solely from above. A similar concept applied with regards to Ishmael, who underwent circumcision at the age of 13, when he had already attained intellectual maturity. Ishmael made an intellectual decision to circumcise himself and enter into a bond with God. So he did participate, and therefore it is specifically Yitzchak's circumcision at 8 days that demonstrate that the bond with God established through circumcision does not come about because of the person being circumcised, that is, by virtue of the input of a created being, but is forged entirely by God. And that's why Yitzchak tells Ishmael, "I'm more cherished." Even though Ishmael had a say, he had to agree. And that concludes our talk, the Rebbe's talk on the idea of
Two
circumcision.
things out of this. One, I've always taken this as understanding why the Arab is so angry, because he had to be circumcised.
Who is very angry?
The Arabs are always angry because they had to be circumcised.
Who told you they are angry?
That's
They are circumcised at a much later point, at a year, up to 13, anytime.
Another question. Women do not have a covenant? Women have a
No,
covenant?
they have the covenant by virtue of being birthed, by being born.
So their covenant's different?
Were you here 2 weeks ago when I spoke about men and women, why we do not perform the same mitzvah by men and women?
No.
Men and women, when God created us, we spoke about it yesterday by the class, are two halves of one. In the creation, God created the tigers, male and female, two.
Yeah.
He created birds, two. Leviathan, two. Everything, two. Human being, one. Why one? And then he says, oh, it's not good for them to be alone, kind of changing his mind, and he's splitting them. Why? And the reason is to remind us that we, the only species on the face of the earth, who will not be able to live a life unless we have a partner. It's impossible. That's why he created one, and he split them into two. Therefore, there are mitzvot that we perform for the spouse, and there are mitzvot the spouse perform for us. If both of us perform the same mitzvah, it's double. Now, prohibitions apply to all. There is no, but positive commandments, there are commandments that are given to male, there are commandments that are given to female. Does that make sense? So performing the covenant with men, it applies to the female as well. According to Kabbalah, she has the covenant. When she was born, she's already into the covenant way before. That's why the name, you give to a name of a girl as soon as she's born. My daughters sometimes were born on a Monday morning, and I would be here already naming her.
Okay.
Yes.
In the case of a convert, is this why a